The marmalade was still warm in the pot. Cecily noticed this because she noticed everything at Draycott Hall, and the marmalade had been placed at the table's center only 4 minutes before the papers arrived, and the kitchen staff kept a precise timetable, and none of them yet knew what the morning would become. The pot sat between the butter dish and the toast rack. Copper, glazed, ordinary. And behind it Sir Philip Draycott unfolded 3 sheets of closely written paper, with the deliberate movements of a man performing a rehearsed scene. The footmen did not look at each other. The butler, Grenham, stood at his post beside the sideboard with the particular stillness of a man who has decided he is not present. "You will find the terms straightforward," Sir Philip said, and smoothed the papers flat on the linen, and looked across the table at her with the expression he wore when settling accounts. "The settlement your father negotiated is dissolved. Your allowance ceases at the end of the quarter. You will, of course, wish to write to your cousin in Hampshire." Cecily did not move. "I have engaged a solicitor on your behalf," he continued, "to ensure no one can suggest I have been ungenerous. Garfield has handled the paperwork. It is entirely regular." She looked at the papers. She looked at the marmalade pot. She looked at her hands, which were folded in her lap, and at the small iron key she had closed her fingers around under the table, and at the thin cord that ran from the key up beneath the line of her gown to where she wore it always, against her sternum, because her father had given it to her the morning before he died and said only, "For the house." And she had not known until this morning what he meant. "Miss Hartwell," Sir Philip said, and the 2 words landed in the room like something dropped from a height. "I require your signature before 10 o'clock as Garfield is needed in town." The footmen did not look at each other. She took the pen he offered. She did not sign. She set the pen precisely beside the marmalade pot, on the white linen, where it made a very small mark. She did not apologize for, "I will need time," she said, "to review the terms." She had already reviewed them. She had reviewed them the night before, when Grenham, who was loyal in ways that had cost him nothing yet, and might cost him everything, had left a copy on her desk. She had reviewed them at 4 in the morning by candlelight, with the household accounts open beside her, because Grenham had also told her that someone had been at the door before dawn, and that the visitor had given his name, and that the name was Lord Ashmore. There are moments when a life turns on a door opened, or a door left shut. She had opened it. She kept her hand over the iron key all the way back up the stairs. To understand what Cecily was, in that autumn of 1812, you would need to walk the house before she woke. The route that mattered was the route she walked every morning at 5, before any housemaid was properly stirring, before the kitchen fires had caught to their full warmth. She walked it not as the mistress inspecting her domain, but as a person responsible for the functioning of a living thing that could not communicate its needs to anyone else who would listen. The roof tiles above the east passage sweated in the wet and needed the bucket placed before rain came, or the carpet was ruined and the carpet was irreplaceable. The cask in the cellar, second from the left, had been incorrectly sealed in September, and the wine inside was turning, and the cellarman had not noticed, and she had noticed, and she had said nothing to Sir Philip because telling Sir Philip things he did not already know produced reactions that cost more than the cask. The kitchen garden's south wall needed repointing, and she had arranged it herself with the mason from the village, and paid him from her own household allowance, which was already short because she had paid the butcher's overrun in October, to prevent the household accounts from showing a deficit that Sir Philip would notice and blame on waste, which was not what it was. The house ran because Cecily ran it. She had married Sir Philip Draycott 4 years prior in the spring of 1808, because her father's affairs were compromised, and Sir Philip had the means to settle the immediate difficulty, and her father had believed the match suitable, and Cecily had believed with the clear-eyed practicality of a woman who had learned early to think about consequences, that a recognized station was worth a great deal even without warmth. She was 22. She thought she understood the terms. What she had not fully understood was that the house itself was her mother's family's house. Not by the terms Sir Philip had described. Not by the documents his solicitor had produced. An older document, a deed of settlement drawn up by her grandfather in 1789, amended by her father in 1806, and left with a small solicitor named to Tobias Farrow in the village of Ashford-on-Wye, 7 miles from Draycott Hall, with instructions that its existence be disclosed to the female Hartwell heir upon the dissolution of any marriage entered into by the female line, if that dissolution was initiated by the husband's unilateral action. Her father had written that clause in 1806, 2 years before her marriage. In the same season, he had begun to understand that her prospects might be complicated by his financial situation, and that the men most likely to marry her would be men whose interest in the match was partly transactional, and that it would be wise to build into the terms a protection she might never need and might never know about. She had known about it since 4 in the morning. Lord Ashmore had found the deed because his own solicitors, settling a boundary question on his neighboring estate, had been required to examine the chain of title for properties along the shared boundary, and the Farrow document had appeared in the parish records where it had always been, quiet and unexamined for 6 years. He had ridden over in the dark. She had come down in her wrapper with the iron key already in her hand before she knew why, and found him in the kitchen passage, with Mr. Dan Farrow and a lantern, and he had taken off his hat and said, very quietly, that he believed she had a right to know this before morning, and that he could not in good conscience leave her uninformed. She had looked at him for a moment in the kitchen candlelight. He was tall, and stood with the particular quality of stillness she had noticed in him at the occasional county assembly. A man who had trained himself not to take up more space than necessary, though he had the kind of frame that took up space regardless. His dark hair was disordered from the ride. His eyes, which were gray and direct, did not offer pity. They offered information. "Tell me what the document says," she had said. He had told her. What she had not known, what she did not discover until much later, was that before he knocked at her door, he had stood in the kitchen passage for 10 full minutes watching her through the half-open door to the still room where she sat at the household accounts by candlelight at 4 in the morning. Her fingers moving across a ledger with the practiced speed of someone who has been doing this for years. He had watched her pull a small purse from her pocket, count coins onto the table, and record a payment in a column he recognized, when he later thought about it, as an account she was settling from her own funds. He had knocked on the door because he believed she deserved to know what he knew. He had stood in the passage for 10 minutes before knocking, because he had not looked through a domestic window and felt the absence of grief for some time. The window was small, and set at an angle that gave him only a partial view, but it was enough. She sat at a narrow table with the household accounts spread in front of her, a single candle set at her left hand, and she moved through the columns with a pen held low and close, the way a person writes who is accustomed to writing without witnesses and has never learned to perform the gesture. The purse she drew from her pocket was not a large one. The coins she counted onto the table were few. She recorded each in a careful hand, and when she was finished, she folded the account closed, and sat for a moment with her palms flat on the cover, as if taking the measure of something, and then opened it again and began to cross-check a second column against the first. He had watched his own wife's hands at a letter once, and had not thought of it since. He thought of it then. He knocked. She had 20 minutes with the document before she needed to be at the breakfast table. She had taken 21. The morning moved in the particular suspended way of mornings, in which large things are already done, and not yet known. Mr. Meadows Farrow had remained in the library, which was unseemly but unavoidable, and which Grenham had managed by the simple expedient of not mentioning it to anyone. Lord Ashmore had gone to wait in the small sitting room that looked over the kitchen garden, which was also unseemly, and which Grenham had managed by providing tea and saying nothing. Cicely sat at the breakfast table and did not sign the papers. Sir Philip's high color rose. He pushed his chair back from the table, which was his signal of displeasure, and 2 footmen rearranged themselves invisibly. "You will find," he said, "that delay serves no one. The terms are more than adequate for a woman in your situation." "My situation," she said. "Miss Hartwell." The words again sharp at the edges. "Your cousin in Hampshire." "I have not decided about Hampshire," she said. "I have decided that I require this morning." She left him at the table with the papers. The library, when she entered it, smelled of dust and the faint cedar wood of old shelving and the entirely incongruous smell of Pharaoh's traveling coat, which was damp from the morning. The small man rose and opened his case, and Lord Ashmore stood at the library window with his hat in his hands, not looking at her yet, looking at the kitchen garden wall she had had repointed in October. The wall needs the upper course redone in spring, she said, because she did not know how to begin, and the wall was what she saw. Lord Ashmore turned from the window. "Miss Hartwell," Pharaoh said gently, "shall we proceed?" The iron key was already in her hand. It opened the strong-box in the library's third drawer, which Sir Philip had always believed contained her late mother's correspondence. Inside the correspondence was a sealed oilskin packet. Inside the packet was the deed. When Pharaoh unfolded it and read the relevant clause aloud, in the quiet library with the morning light beginning at the windows and the household moving to its routines overhead, the sound of it was very small for something so definitive. "If the husband shall initiate dissolution of the said marriage, or shall cause the marriage to be dissolved by his own unilateral action, the property known as Draycott Hall and its attendant lands shall revert in fee simple to the female Hartwell heir, her heirs and assigns." Cecily did not look at Lord Ashmore. She looked at the deed. "Sir Philip's solicitor," she said, "did not know this existed." "Apparently not," Pharaoh said. "And when he serves the divorce papers this morning," she said, "he will have initiated the dissolution by his own unilateral action." "That is my understanding," Pharaoh said. "Yes." She was quiet for a moment. "He has already said the words at the breakfast table," she said, "in front of 2 footmen and the butler." Pharaoh's mild eyes blinked once, twice. "Then, I believe," he said, "the clause has already been triggered." She pressed the iron key against her palm until she felt the shape of it in her skin, and then she told Pharaoh to proceed. Lord Ashmore remained by the window throughout. At one point, when Pharaoh required the deed, countersigned by a witness of standing, she looked at him, and he came to the table without being asked, and signed his name in the place Pharaoh indicated with the straight, unhurried hand of a man who signs his name to things he means. She did not thank him then. She thought she would later, and did not have the words yet, and he seemed to understand this because he went back to the window. "There is one other matter," he said, after a moment. She looked up. "I have a portrait in my hall," he said, not to her, still to the window. "My wife. She died 4 years ago. The child with her." He was quiet for a moment. "I have not come uninvited into another person's domestic arrangements since that morning. I did not do so lightly today." She understood that he was telling her this because she needed to understand what the gesture cost. She held the iron key a little tighter. "If you are still with this story, if you feel the weight of what Cecily is holding in that library, stay close, because the mourning is not yet done, and the house has not yet decided who it belongs to." The next hours were the longest of Cecily's memory. Lady Constance Draycott arrived from the village at 11:30, as she always did on Wednesdays, in the black carriage with the Draycott crest, and with her came Sophronia Melford, in a gown the particular shade of blue that Cecily recognized as a woman dressed for a specific occasion. Sophronia had dark hair dressed very high, diamonds at her ears at 11 in the morning, and the smile of a person who has been told good news and is being gracious about it. Lady Constance swept into the entrance hall and paused, and looked at Cecily and said, "Miss Hartwell," without inflection, the way one names an object being removed from a room. Cecily did not correct her. "Lady Constance," she said. "Miss Melford, I hope you will take tea." She said this with absolute composure and showed them to the drawing-room herself, because she was still the one who knew where everything was, and because the housekeeper, Mrs. Durrant, was watching from the passage with an expression that mixed fury with professional restraint, and Cecily did not want anyone to say anything yet that could not be unsaid. In the drawing-room, Sophronia seated herself in the chair that Cecily had always preferred, the one nearest the window that caught the afternoon light, and picked up a small porcelain figure from the side table and examined it with the proprietary interest of a person already calculating how to redecorate. "Philip tells me the settlement is quite straightforward," Lady Constance said, smoothing her gloves. "Your cousin in Hampshire, I understand. You are kind to concern yourself," Cecily said. Sophronia set the porcelain figure down in a slightly different position. "Of course," Lady Constance continued. "The redecorating will want doing. The drawing room has not been touched since your time here, Miss Hartwell, and one can see it." She said it pleasantly. She meant it kindly, in the way that people mean things that wound without being cruel, from within a confidence so complete it is never considered being wrong. From the passage outside, Cecily heard a footman say to someone in the kitchen, in the carrying voice of a young man not yet trained out of it, "Her ladyship says she's Miss Hartwell now." Said it again in the hall to Miss Melford. She heard this quite clearly. She took one breath, and then she took the tea tray from Grenham's hands herself, because her hands needed something to hold. Lord Ashmore appeared in the doorway of the drawing room at 20 minutes past 12. He had not gone. She had known he had not gone, in the way that one knows where a person is in a house when one is paying attention, which she always was, because the house was what she attended to. He had remained in the library. He had at some point been given more tea by Grenham, who had developed opinions about the morning without expressing them to anyone. "Lady Constance," he said from the doorway, and there was something in the way he said it that made the room stop. Not a command, not even a challenge. Simply the way a man says a name when he intends to be heard. "I had not realized you were expected." Lady Constance's fan paused in its motion. "Lord Ashmore," her tone recalibrated upward, as it always did for a viscount. "I was not aware you were acquainted with my daughter-in-law." "That is to say, with Miss Hartwell. We have a mutual acquaintance," he said. "Mr. Farrow." A pause. "I do not believe I know the name." "You will," he said, and came into the drawing room and placed himself near the window, with the absolute ease of a man who outranks every person in the room, and does not need to say so, and looked at Cecily with those direct gray eyes, and said, at a volume intended only for her, "Are you all right?" It was such a simple question. She had not been asked it in some time. "Yes," she said, and felt the iron key through the fabric of her gown, and it was not quite true, but it was what she had, and he seemed to understand the distinction. He did not touch her. He stood near her at the window and looked out at the kitchen garden wall, while Lady Constance and Sophronia exchanged glances behind them. And the afternoon gathered itself toward dinner, and the house waited. She was aware of him with the particular acuity of a woman who has trained herself not to show awareness, which is its own kind of attention, sharper than the ordinary kind because it must hide itself as it works. She could have described, without looking, exactly where he stood, 2 feet to her right, turned slightly toward the glass. His weight distributed with the steadiness of a man accustomed to standing still in rooms where other people were performing. She was aware of the quality of his silence, which was different from Sir Philip's silence. Sir Philip's silence had always been an absence of approval. This silence was something else, something that held steady without requiring her to fill it. Lady Constance spoke again about the drawing-room curtains, and Cecily answered, and her voice was level, and her hands were folded, and none of it reached the place in her chest, where the iron key rested against her sternum warm from her body heat, the weight of it small and definitive as a full stop at the end of a very long sentence. She had gone to the morning room at 3 o'clock, when Farrow had confirmed the transfer in the relevant parish record and the document was formally executed. She sat in the chair by the cold fireplace, because she had not asked anyone to light it, and she held the iron key in her lap. She had expected to feel something definitive. The legal language had been precise, the clause clear, the instrument properly signed and witnessed, and now recorded. The house was hers. The breakfast parlor and the kitchen garden and the leaking roof tiles above the east passage, and the turning cask in the cellar, and the cook's accounts, and the butcher's overrun, and the carefully maintained fiction that everything was running smoothly. All of it was hers. She felt nothing like what she had expected. She felt instead the particular suspension of a person standing between one life that is closed and another that has not yet opened any of its doors, and she was not sure she had the vocabulary for what came next, because she had spent 4 years arranging the interior life of this house so that everything functioned, and she had not, in all that time, given much sustained thought to what Cecily Hartwell might want when she was not managing something. Outside the door, she heard a voice she recognized. Lady Constance was speaking to Mrs. Bid. Durant in the corridor with the authority of a woman who has always been obeyed. The blue room will want airing before Miss Melford can be shown it properly. Have one of the girls attend to it this afternoon, Mrs. Durant's voice came back very quiet. I beg your pardon, my lady, but I do not believe that instruction comes from the correct quarter. A silence. Then Lady Constance again, her voice raised slightly. Miss Hartwell is no longer mistress of this house. Then Mrs. Durant, still quiet, with the particular steel of a woman who has been in service for 30 years, and knows precisely what quiet costs and what it is worth. You may find, my lady, that Miss Hartwell is rather more the mistress of this house than she was this morning. A long silence. Then, footsteps. Cecily sat in the cold room and turned the iron key in her hands, and felt its edges and thought about her father at his desk in the autumn of 1806, with the deed of settlement and a daughter he believed he might have through no malice, compromised, and a solicitor he trusted, and the particular stubbornness of a man who believed that his failures could be undone, even slowly, even from beyond whatever morning was coming. The iron key was still warm from her hands. She set it on the arm of the chair and looked at it for a long moment. She was not rescued. That was the thing she needed to sit with in the cold room before she went anywhere. She was not rescued by Lord Ashmore's arrival, or by Pharaoh's document, or by the legal clause her father had built into the foundation of everything. She had been given a door. She had chosen in 21 minutes to walk through it. She had signed her name to the document herself. She had handed the iron key to Pharaoh herself, and watched him open the strongbox herself, and identified the deed herself, because she was the one who had known, without knowing why she knew, that the key's weight was wrong for something purely decorative. She had been here. She had paid attention. She had kept accounts. The rest was her father building a door. She picked up the iron key and put it back on the cord, and stood and went to light the fire herself. The dining room at Draycott Hall held a table that seated 30, and was laid most evenings for 4 or 5. That evening, it was laid for 3. Sir Philip sat at the head, Lady Constance at the foot, and Sophronia to his right, in the chair that was placed for the guest of honor. Sir Philip had changed for dinner, and wore the pleased expression of a man who has completed a disagreeable administrative task and is now free to enjoy the meal. Sophronia wore more diamonds. Lady Constance had ordered the good wine brought up, the Bordeaux, without consulting anyone, because she had ordered the good wine brought up in this house for 30 years, and saw no reason to alter the habit tonight. They did not see Lord Ashmore until he was already in the room. He walked in from the passage, as Grenham was serving the first course, unhurried with Pharaoh a step behind him, and he went directly to the head of the table, which meant he walked past Sophronia, and past Lady Constance, and came to stand at Sir Philip's right hand with the particular quality of stillness that Cecily had noticed the first time she saw him. The quality of a man who does not perform an entrance because he does not need to. Ashmore. Sir Philip set down his wine-glass. The color that came into his face was not quite anger, and not quite comprehension. This is not a convenient evening. I understand, Lord Ashmore said. I am afraid the matter will not hold. What matter? Grenham behind the sideboard held himself absolutely still. Lord Ashmore looked at Pharaoh, who opened his case and placed on the table beside the first course the executed deed, and the parish record notation and the transfer instrument, all in a neat sequence, and stepped back. This morning, Lord Ashmore said, you served dissolution papers to Cecily Hartwell. You addressed her as Miss Hartwell in the presence of your household staff, thus formally initiating dissolution by your unilateral action, before 2 witnesses in service and 1 in management. This action triggered the reversion clause in the Hartwell Deed of Settlement of 1789, as amended, 1806, as executed and registered in the parish record of Ashford-on-Wye at 1 o'clock this afternoon. He looked at Sir Philip steadily. Sir Philip looked at the papers on the table beside his soup. "This is not possible," Sir Philip said. "Garfield assured me." "Garfield was not given access to the Farrow document," Lord Ashmore said. "There was a good reason for that. The silence in the dining room was the particular silence of a room in which everyone present understands something has shifted, and no one is yet ready to name it. This house," Lord Ashmore said, "belongs to Miss Hartwell, as it always did." It was 12 words. He had said them at dinner, at the head of the table in the room where the papers had been served over marmalade that morning, in front of the butler and 2 footmen, and the woman who had ordered the good wine brought up without asking. Sophronia set down her fish fork, very carefully. Lady Constance's hand went to the strand of pearls at her throat. "Philip," she said, and her voice was different. Thinner, with the specific thinness of a confidence that has met something it did not prepare for. "Philip, what does this mean?" Sir Philip did not answer her. He looked at the deed. He looked at it for a long time, with the expression of a man reading a document that says something he did not expect and cannot immediately decide is a mistake, and slowly understanding it is not a mistake, and slowly understanding what it means that he has served the papers this morning and called her Miss Hartwell in front of the footman and the butler, and that the words are irrevocable, and that he cannot retract the action that triggered the clause, because the clause was triggered at the breakfast table before 9 o'clock, and it is now 7 in the evening, and it has already been registered. "You will want to engage your solicitor," Lord Ashmore said, "who will confirm what Mr. Farrow has already registered. The matter is not in dispute." Sir Philip looked up. He looked at Lord Ashmore with an expression Cecily, in the doorway behind them, recognized as the expression he wore when the household accounts showed something he could not correct, not fury, not grief, but the particular blankness of a man whose script has been removed from his hands mid-scene. He did not look at her. He pushed back his chair and stood, and picked up his wine-glass and set it down again without drinking. "I will speak to Garfield in the morning," he said, to no one in particular. He left the dining room. Sophronia looked at Lady Constance. Lady Constance looked at the documents on the table. Sophronia rose, smoothed her gown, said nothing, and followed Sir Philip out. Lady Constance sat for another moment. She looked at the wine-glass she had ordered brought up, and at the soup that was already cooling, and at the papers on the table, and at some fixed middle distance beyond all of it. "I have sat at the foot of this table for 30 years, she said. Not to Lord Ashmore, not to Farrow, not quite to Cecily. To the room. "Yes," Cecily said from the doorway. Lady Constance looked at her. "I did not believe," Lady Constance said slowly, "that a woman in your position could." She did not finish the sentence. Perhaps she did not know how to finish it. The clause she had started was built on an assumption that was no longer available to her, and she was old enough and honest enough to sit for a moment with the absence of it. She rose. She gathered her gloves. She looked at the table once more, at the Bordeaux in the decanter, the good wine she had ordered. "I imagine," she said with the composed certainty of a woman who has survived many things and will survive this, "that you will find the cellar in reasonable order." "The second cask from the left is turning," Cecily said. "I have known since September." Lady Constance was quiet for a moment. "Then you had better have it decanted," she said, "before it goes entirely," and she left the room. Farrow gathered his papers with the brisk efficiency of a small solicitor who has seen a great deal of human feeling in his years and prefers to disappear as soon as the legal business is concluded. He aligned the documents with the careful habit of a man who has built a life on the premise that order is a form of respect for consequence. He returned the deed to its oilskin envelope. He returned the parish record notation to its folder. He said, "Good evening," in a voice that conveyed nothing except that he had done what he came to do and trusted the people present to manage the rest. He said he would call in the morning. He put on his hat in the passage and went out into the cold without being shown to the door, because he had come in the same way, and saw no reason to require ceremony for his departure. The dining room was empty, except for Lord Ashmore and Cecily and Grenham, who was still at his post by the sideboard with the absolute stillness of a professional who has witnessed something significant and will not name it until asked. "Grenham," Cecily said. "Miss Hartwell, have the fire made up in the breakfast room, please." "Yes, Miss Hartwell." He was gone without another word. She stood in the dining room for a moment, at the head of the table where the papers still lay, and Lord Ashmore stood to her right, and the soup was cold, and the good wine was still in the decanter, and the room was very quiet. "You stayed," she said. "Pharaoh required a witness of standing for the evening confirmation," he said. "Is that why?" He looked at her. His gray eyes were direct, as they had been in the kitchen passage at 4 in the morning, and they offered the same thing they had offered then. Not comfort, not sentiment, but information, delivered honestly by a person who had decided she deserved to have it. "No," he said. She picked up the deed from the table and folded it along its original crease and held it against her chest for a moment. "Come and sit," she said, "if you have not eaten." The breakfast room was small and overlooked the kitchen garden. A maid had lit the fire, and the grate was beginning to hold warmth, and the table was set for 1 because Cecily had not thought ahead to 2, but Grenham appeared silently, with a second cup and a cold supper from the kitchen. The kind of cold supper that materializes in well-managed houses when the cook understands that the formal meal has failed, and something else is needed. They sat across the table from each other in the firelight, and Cecily poured the tea herself because she had been pouring the tea herself in this house for 4 years, and because Lord Ashmore did not move to take the pot from her, which she appreciated. She set her cup down. She had been holding the iron key in her left hand since the dining room, and now she opened her hand and set it on the table between them, on the white cloth where it caught the firelight. "He gave it to me the morning before he died," she said. "He said, for the house. I thought he was delirious or sentimental. I wore it anyway." Lord Ashmore looked at the key. "He was not delirious," he said. "He was specific," he said. "He was planning. He was doing the only thing he knew how to do for you from where he stood, which was to build you a door you could walk through if you needed it, and trust that you would know it was a door." She looked at the key. "I did not know," she said. "Not until you came. You would have found it," he said. "Perhaps not today. You would have found it." She was not sure this was true, and he seemed to know she was not sure, and he did not press it. They were quiet for a while. The fire settled in the grate. Outside the window, the kitchen garden was dark, the repointed wall invisible, the shapes of the beds flattened by the early winter cold. She knew every inch of it, the wall and the beds and the gate that needed a new hinge, and the south-facing corner where the herbs held longest into the autumn because it caught an additional hour of the pale afternoon sun. She knew which flagstone lifted in the rain and pooled water at the kitchen passage door, and which latch on the potting house stuck after frost, and where the robin had nested last spring in the old laurel by the south wall. She knew this house the way she knew her own hands. She had not chosen it. In the beginning, it had become hers anyway. "The household accounts," Lord Ashmore said after a while. "Are they in order?" She looked up. "The accounts?" "I ask because," he said, "in practical terms there will be matters to manage. The solicitors, the question of what Sir Philip will dispute and what he will not, the staff situation, while that is resolved." He looked at the table, not quite at her. "I have a capable steward, who is not presently fully occupied, and I have some experience of property administration, having managed my own estate through a period when I was not attending to it. Well, I thought I might offer, if it would not be unwelcome, a certain practical assistance, for as long as is useful." He was offering to stay. Not in the house. Not in any way that was improper. He was offering to be adjacent, to be available, to bring his steward and his experience and his steady gray eyes to the business of the months ahead, which would be complicated and which she would be managing alone if he did not offer. She looked at him for a long time. "The accounts are in excellent order," she said. "I have kept them so." "I would expect nothing less," he said. "However," she said, and she felt something warm and specific rise in her chest, something she did not yet have the name for but recognized as the sensation of a closed door opening. "The East Passage roof wants attention before spring, and the cellar's second cask is turning, and the South Garden wall will need the upper course redone come March." "Those are specific problems," he said. "I have specific plans for them," she said, "and a very small budget, and no one to carry a ladder." He looked at her, and she thought she saw the corner of his mouth move the first approach of something that was not quite a smile, suppressed with the discipline of a man who has not permitted himself much levity. "I believe," he said, "that I can manage a ladder." She picked up the iron key from the table. It was warm from her hand. The fire had caught fully now, and the room was quiet in the way of rooms that have found their proper use after a long time of being used for something else, and Lord Ashmore's dark coat and the white of his cravat caught the firelight at the edge of her vision, and outside the window the kitchen garden was invisible but entirely known. "Cecily," he said. It was the first time. Her given name, low and level, carrying no particular inflection except the deliberate choice to use it, as if it were something he had been holding in mind all day and had decided, now that the house was quiet and the legal business was concluded and the evening was long and the fire was warm, to finally set down in the space between them where it belonged. She looked at him. "Yes," she said to the name. To everything the name carried. To the morning that had begun before light with a knocked door and a lantern, and a man who had ridden over in the dark because he believed she had a right to know. Outside, the first frost of the season was settling over the kitchen garden. She could not see it. She knew it was there. The iron key lay warm in the cup of her palm. She closed her fingers around it, not because she needed to hold on, but because it was hers, and it had always been hers, and she was learning, slowly, as the fire burned and the frost came and the house breathed around them, what it felt like to hold something you did not have to put down again. If Cecily's morning moved you, if you felt the weight of that iron key, the cold of the breakfast table, the warmth of the fire at the end, leave a word in the comments. We will be here again. And thank you genuinely for staying until the end.